All right. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And we're happy you joined us today. This is Ken Connor, and I'm going to get us started, and Shannon and I will tag team this as we go through the presentation. Today, we want to cover really three major points. One is talk about and define fair market value and commercial reasonableness so that you have a basic understanding of these concepts when it comes time to use those services. And then the kind of impetus for this seminar was to take that baseline of knowledge and be able to roll into it the other information that's going on in healthcare. Hospitals are, focused on how do they, now that they employ or contract with physicians, make that work best for both the physician and the hospital. And that has brought in measures of productivity, and we'll talk about some of those and discuss pros and cons of those. And then finally, a lot of the fair market value and compensation revolves around a variety of surveys, and we thought it important that you have an understanding of those surveys. The entire driver to the fair market value and commercial reasonableness is based in some of the healthcare regulation, which everybody will recognize. Stark Law being the one that maybe gets the most attention, but this also implicates anti-kickback, False Claim Act, and to the extent that it's a not-for-profit or governmental hospital, then private benefit and private inurement can also enter into the review of the arrangements. The Stark regulation dealing with self-referral and anti-kickback prohibits physicians from making referrals for designated health services. And the financial relationship can either be direct or indirect. Our focus today is on that direct employed or contracted relationship. And as far as designated health services, again, these are fairly straightforward and have been around for a number of years, but these are the services that we talk about when we talk about designated health services. So a physician may be making referrals to the hospital, but they may be also ordering services from related entities or other outside vendors where they may have financial arrangements. And the anti-kickback statute prohibits knowingly and willingly receiving direct or indirect payments in return for referring patients to or arranging the furnishing of services for which payment may be made under federal health care programs. And now I'm going to let Shannon pick up with some of the definitions.
Okay. So now that Ken has pointed out really the umbrella of regulations that we as healthcare consultants and valuation analysts need to be aware of, I'm not going to read the definition of fair market value defined in Stark, but I did want to share the definition of fair market value that's used by appraisers, business appraisers, and that is the price expressed in terms of cash equivalents at which property would change hands between a hypothetical willing and able buyer and a hypothetical willing and able seller acting at arm's length in an open and unrestricted market when neither is under compulsion to buy or sell and when both have reasonable knowledge of the relevant facts. And that's out of the International Glossary of Business Valuation Terms. And the reason that I wanted to share that today is when we do these types of fair market value determinations, we take those definitions into account. And one thing that's interesting about the Stark definition that you don't see in this overall international glossary definition is this point who are not otherwise in a position to generate business for the other party. And so that's really where Stark is honing in on the fact that these transactions are between parties who are in a position to generate business for the other party. And on the next slide, we'll see what that really gets to is the volume or value of anticipated or actual referrals. So that's really the overriding consideration when we look at these agreements. Exactly what this says, where the price or compensation, we do not want to determine that in any manner that takes into account the volume or value of anticipated or actual referrals that could result from the proposed arrangement, or in the case of a contract that already exists, when it comes time to renewing that contract or re-examining that contract in any way in a review, is it taking into account the volume or value of anticipated or actual referrals? So really that's where these healthcare regulations are putting in an additional consideration over and above what might apply in industries that don't receive the significant amount of government assistance that comes through to healthcare through the Medicare, Medicaid programs.
And now might be a good time for our first polling question.
Yes. Pam, can you share the first polling question?
Yes. Does your hospital have a formal physician compensation governance process? And just a reminder, you do need to answer 2/3 of the polling questions to be eligible for CPEs. And I'll give that just a few more minutes. Okay, 100% has voted. It looks like 56% say yes, 13% says no, and 31% is unsure.
Okay. So now that we've talked about fair market value, we'll talk a little bit about commercial reasonableness. And really the interesting thing to me about commercial reasonableness is despite numerous references to CR, which I'll call it for short, it's not defined in the Stark law or in the anti-kickback statute. It is evident that CR is a term used to frame out an acceptable structure for an arrangement, and there is a definition that appears in commentary from CMS, which says that an arrangement will be considered commercially reasonable in the absence of referrals if the arrangement would make commercial sense if entered into by a reasonable entity of similar type and size and a reasonable physician of similar scope and specialty, even if there were no designated health services referrals. So the way I like to think about it is fair market value is more of a numerical range, and commercial reasonableness is more of a yes or no type decision. But it's a chicken and the egg because you can't really have one without the other.
And I think that it's commercial reasonableness. We've seen that become more important in the last couple of years based on a number of cases. And historically, or early in Stark, we might have looked at fair market value and commercial reasonableness as all being together, or commercial reasonableness is, well, of course, it has to make sense, and then we would move on. But we're finding that, you know, as the government kind of looks at these arrangements, we have to take a broader look. So we're going to cover some of the things that might be in that broader look.
Yes. And one thing I would point out as we go through these elements to consider when assessing whether a proposed or existing arrangement is commercially reasonable is, you know, you can't look at any one element of the agreement in a vacuum. And I'll go ahead and say we get a lot of questions from hospitals and their attorneys asking us, you know, well, is there a certain length of time that you would refuse to issue a commercially reasonable opinion on? You know, is that 2 years? Is it 3 years? And, I would say, and we're going to talk a little bit about monitoring and oversight a little later, and that's a good example of how these elements can work together, because in our opinion, if the agreement has provisions where oversight and monitoring would be effective and could impact the compensation under the agreement, then a longer term might be appropriate. Whereas a term that didn't have perhaps as robust monitoring and oversight provisions, it would be less likely that a longer term would be commercially reasonable in that instance. So I guess the takeaway here is to look at these individually and in total. Certainly we're going to need to understand both for assessing commercial reasonableness and determining fair market value, is the arrangement for a full-time position or is it only part-time? Under compensation, and that's certainly where our focus is today, we've seen a lot of different arrangements. Certainly the movement is from a fixed compensation more toward a production formula. If that's the case, a periodic review of that formula compensation is going to be very important. The ability to adjust the compensation or formula, and that would be especially true in situations where the physician's role has changed during the course of the agreement. If the role changes, then the hospital needs to have the ability to adjust that compensation or formula to meet the new duties or expectations. Another thing that's important to consider is what is the net cost of the agreement to the hospital? And that would be especially where the hospital's agreeing to cover certain expenses of the physician on his or her behalf, such as malpractice insurance, also any kind of employment benefits, eligibility for pension and fringe benefits. Really, we're looking at the agreement in total. And the reason, which you guys probably already are aware of the many recent cases that are involving START violations, False Claims Act verdicts, anti-kickback violations, these are just a short list. There are certainly several more that you guys hear about in the paper, and it is really a hot topic. So that's why we're talking about it today, and also available to answer questions that you might have. I won't go into each of these cases because I don't want to get sidetracked from our main topic, but I would just say that these are all suits that have involved hospital-physician relations and contracts. Okay, so I'm going to segue into, so how do we determine fair market value? And really, because there's not a body of standards that relate to determining fair market value of compensation like we have standards to determine the value of a business. But what practitioners have done is adapt the three commonly accepted approaches to business valuation to determining the fair market value of physician comp. The first is the asset or cost approach, and to me the best way to describe that is if you're doing a joint physician acquisition at the same time that you're entering into these post-transaction arrangements. The asset or cost approach is really taking a look at what was in place at the practice prior to the transaction. And what was the practice, what was the physician costing the practice before the acquisition? And the income approach, that's more of a forward-looking approach that's comparing the future benefits to be received by the buyer and or the seller under the compensation arrangement. And you have to be careful in the income approach to exclude any synergistic post-transaction referrals that are expected to be generated as a result of the transaction. The third approach, which is the market approach, is certainly the prevailing method at this time, and maybe a better way to refer to this market approach would be, it's, quote, the survey approach, because we're looking at existing surveys and comparing those surveys to the arrangement that we are analyzing. And we're going to get into the surveys a little more in a later slide. In my opinion, regardless of which approach is being used, it's very important to understand the various productivity and volume metrics. And I want to make sure that I point out here that exactly which of these metrics is important would depend on the physician's specialty. So we're not going to try today to go into exactly which metric is more important for which specialty, but I did want to point out that certain of these are going to be more important and or less important depending on the specialty of the physician that the arrangement is targeted to. So we'll get into this in a little more in depth, but we always like to look at what professional collections or cash that the physician is generating as a metric. We also want to understand the non-physician cash that's being generated. That goes hand in hand with what kind of supervision the physician might be performing for mid-levels, but not actually generating cash under his professional collection records. Of course, all of this is tied into understanding the billing system and reports that's been in place. What kind of technical component revenue is being generated. I mentioned the breakdown between physician personally performed versus the mid-level provider efforts, and then it's also important to understand both past and then in the future what type of charity and indigent care the physician will be expected to provide. A few other considerations that may be part of the compensation arrangement but not at all tied to productivity measures would be call requirements. If there's a role of a manager or a medical directorship, and then quality initiatives, which are being more and more incorporated into these agreements. And we'll touch on all these in a little more depth as we get through. So before we jump into the surveys, Ken's going to discuss a bit about the recent OIG fraud alert, which is, to my knowledge, the first correspondence that was specifically directed toward physicians, and it came out just this summer in June of 2015.
So in June, the OIG issues a fraud alert, and it is directed at the physician. It is the OIG putting the physician on notice that they are responsible for their arrangements. Physicians have typically relied on the hospital and probably complained about the hospital's process a little bit, but in fact they are a party to those medical director or other compensation arrangements, and I think the OIG is looking to hold both parties accountable. And I doubt that very many physicians actually saw this unless it showed up in the literature, but it would be a pretty convicting notice if you shared it with any physician with whom you're working on a medical directorship, or for that matter, any kind of compensation arrangement. And it talks about fair market value. The other thing, you always want to be able to document, in the case of the medical directorship, the services that are being provided, so it holds the physician accountable to those. And while I don't think it changed any of the current law or regulation, it truly kind of emphasizes the direction that the OIG is going, and that they will go after the physician as well as the hospital in these processes. And I think Pam, I think we're now to the second polling question.
Okay. The second question is, what productivity measures are often used by your hospital as a basis for determining physician compensation? And we've got a couple of selections there. I just want to remind everyone that you need to answer 2/3 in order to receive your CPE. And it looks like everyone is about finished, so I'll give it just a few more seconds before I close it. Okay, and it looks like we've got 50% saying WRVUs, 0% patient encounter office visits. We've got 6% cash collections, patient revenue, 34% a combination of productivity measures, and 9% provider compensation is set and not dependent on productivity. Okay.
Okay, so here's a little bit more of exactly what questions we would ask in assessing commercial reasonableness. And the first section of questions definitely goes to, is there a legitimate business purpose to the proposed arrangement? And you can see some of the important factors that we would talk about in this piece of the assessment would be, what is the hospital's mission, strategy, financial goals, and how does the healthcare provider, subject to the proposed arrangement, fit into those goals? A lot of talking about commercial reasonableness is, does it make rational sense just from a general business perspective, and not to see the potential relationship in a vacuum? Does it contribute to the hospital's profits or development of a needed line of service? And that's an area that we're really hearing a lot more about is the physician relationship, considering the agreed upon compensation, contributing to the hospital's profits? And if it's not, is it contributing to a needed line of service? Another consideration is, does the arrangement require services to be performed by a physician, or could another person with a special skill set or experience or specialized training, of course mid-levels would fit into those considerations? Are the duties and responsibilities clearly defined? That's very important to understand exactly what the arrangement is requiring the physician to do. Really we can't do a great job at determining fair market value if we can't understand what the duties and responsibilities that need to be performed are. And then, is the amount of time required to perform the services reasonable? And I think that's one of the aspects that came out in the Toomey case, because obviously those physicians were only working there at the hospital part-time, but the agreement was providing compensation more on a full-time basis. Without getting into all the details of Toomey, let's just say it's important to make sure that the amount of time required is spelled out in the agreement, and that that's the amount of time that's used to determine the compensation rate. Understanding the facility is important, and the patient needs, also the patient acuity levels that the hospital is experiencing. On resource analysis, is the arrangement providing a duplicative service or potential for misuse, and then are there controls and safeguards in place? Independence and oversight, I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the term, but is there going to be a regular evaluation? Is that a formal process? How are those evaluations used by the provider? And there I would say it's important not to just do an evaluation, but to incorporate that evaluation into the ongoing compensation provided by the agreement. What types of monitoring are used? And then, does the arrangement produce verifiable outcomes? And I would say if the arrangement is designed to achieve a verifiable outcome, it's important to follow up on that and measure that outcome. Okay, now Ken is going to get into more on the surveys that are very frequently used currently to determine the fair market value.
And I want to take just a minute to touch on the independent and oversight. This is truly has to be a team effort. It is not solely a compliance issue. It is not a physician operations issue. It is not a financial issue. It is not just a legal issue. All these things come together, and all of those parties, and probably some others inside your institution, should be participating in how this works. There's maybe one single point of accountability of that physician to an individual, but it touches all of those areas, and so you want to make sure that you're getting timely and good input from all of those affected. I think everybody's familiar with the discussion around surveys. Probably the one most familiar to everybody is MGMA. I'm going to touch on them. In the Start 2 regs, there was actually a safe harbor that said if you use 3 of the 5 surveys, you were good to go. They have since unwound that and said, well, no, that doesn't work, partially because the 5 surveys didn't actually exist in a way that could be readily used by everyone, and there were surveys that weren't on that list. What guidance we do have now is around looking for multiple data points. So there's no specific safe harbor, but there is encouragement around using multiple surveys where the information is available. So the big ones, AMGA, and then, which is American Medical Group Association, which is more the physician leaders, and then Medical Group Management Association, which is more the practice administrators. Both have had in the past fairly active surveys. Sullivan Cotter has a large survey base, actually helps AMGA conduct their surveys, but theirs goes beyond just the AMGA. And we've noted in there, MGMA includes clinical and medical directorate. They now offer information on call pay. The IHS, which has been around for a while doing compensation, and we've noted their medical director survey, but most recently they've sought to collect survey data, and so we would expect to have another new survey of practices added, and then hospital and healthcare compensation primarily focus on hospital employed physicians. One of the things we're seeing is a trend within the surveys, and it varies by specialty, but the number of participating groups, and in some cases the number of participating physicians, is declining. And those surveys are going to be less useful going forward, depending on how few people ultimately respond. I would encourage everybody on the hospital side, because a lot of these surveys, a lot of the participants are dropping off because they are now hospital employed, but that the hospital find one or more surveys to participate in so that there is a good group of data points to kind of measure from. And then I've already talked about the change in the safe harbor and using multiple surveys as support in the fair market value determination of compensation. And we're looking at the total compensation. We're not looking at one piece of compensation and then moving on to the second piece and having them stand alone. I think you have to be looking at the total compensation for the duties, and where there are hours under the term of the contract, are those hours sustainable over the term of the contract? We had one group who was actually starting a new service, and so the number of hours in the first year was allowed was higher than it was on a continuing or go-forward basis.
And one thing I would point out too, when you use these surveys, it's very important to understand, to actually read the definitions that the survey provider publishes along with its data, because, for example, if you're stacking a medical directorship on top of a rate per RVU, make sure that you understand that the survey data does not already have medical directorship compensation baked in to the surveyed results for RVU rates. It's important to understand because I think AMGA excludes medical directorship compensation, whereas MGMA includes it, and understand exactly how they're deriving the data that you're using to support the compensation from your specific agreement. And it might be different. If you use 3 surveys, it could be slightly different in your use of each of those 3.
But certainly stacking is one area of risk where you're compensating the physician on worked RVUs for his practice. He's paid a medical directorship, and then he's paid call. You start to add those things together, stacked on top of each other, and the total compensation may not be fair market value. So the productivity, everybody wants to go to productivity. We want to avoid some of the problems we had in the late 90s with guaranteed contracts and how hard was the physician going to work. Most of the physicians we talk to already understand this and are more than open to, it's kind of still eat what you kill even after they leave private practice. But it's important to understand what makes up, because as that physician looks at it in their private practice, they're aggregating a lot of things to get to their total compensation. And as the hospital starts to pull some of those pieces apart, you have to know how you're going to deal with them. So the professional collections of cash, what is the physician really producing? That one's an easy, very straightforward item. But as you're measuring that, how in his data has incident 2 been considered? You may have a practice where the physician is billing for the mid-level provider, but all of the productivity is under the physician. And so you have to be able to identify, what is that physician's productivity going forward? Technical component, most physicians are making a profit off of ancillary services in their offices. That has contributed to their income. They may not be entitled to compensation from those technical components because they will be, once the hospital has employed them, they become referrals by that physician. But how is that transfer of technical component between his practice and the hospital handled? If he has an MRI, an orthopedic surgeon who has an MRI attached to his practice, how is that, the earnings off of that MRI going to factor going forward? He can't get the money for the referral, but he is going to be short from a compensation standpoint. And can that? So how do we balance that? Does the hospital pay up front for the MRI? Is it baked into his total compensation calculation without regard to the referral? All those things have to be worked forward. Personally performed, I touched on mid-level, but there may be mid-levels where they are not incident to the physician's service. They may be operating in a satellite office, or they may be performing certain hospital visits where the physician doesn't meet the criteria of incident 2. And so you have to, there's also potential income off of this, much like the technical component. And then finally, going forward, many of the physicians that get employed don't have a large charity or indigent practice. They certainly will have some, and may get referrals from the ER, et cetera, but the hospital may be looking to, actually meet a specific community need and being able to provide more in the way of charity or indigent care that is unmet in the community. So how do we add this into the physician's compensation? And if we're working off of worked RVUs, the physician will no longer concern themselves the patient has insurance or not. But it's something that needs to have specific consideration going forward. The worked RVU analysis, and that's the one, I think, in the polling question, 50% said they were using worked RVUs. You have to understand what's in worked RVUs. When the modifiers applied to worked RVUs, when not properly applied, can either overstate or understate compensation. We already talked about the RVUs associated with Incident 2 in the supervision of extenders. How's that going to work in the hospital employment model? More practically, it may make sense for part of the compensation to include a fixed fee for the supervision with specific tasks or obligations related to that supervision. And remember that the worked RVUs, where we instituted them so that the physician had an incentive to work, the opposite can be true. The physician may focus their entire effort on those things that have the highest worked RVUs. So they may move parts of their practice or concentrate parts of their practice in certain areas, certain surgical procedures or certain office procedures that push up the RVUs while neglecting other pieces of the puzzle. And so we need a proper balance. One consideration is to include patient encounters and office visits. If an individual surgeon is making all of his money off of RVUs in the operating room, he's going to figure out how to minimize his time in the office. But as a practical matter, long term, if he's not making those office visits and the patient encounters, he's going to see that practice suffer, and the hospital's not going to get the, may have sought to increase access in the community and find that the access is not improved as much as they had hoped. So one option is to use multiple pieces, including the number of patient encounters, visits conducted in the office. So as we look at an RVU analysis, and when I see the reports that are being processed, I'm usually worried that we will have overstated RVUs. We actually had one where if you're not using the proper modifier, you might understate the RVUs on a physician. In this case, this happens to be, if you know anything about CPT codes, you'll quickly recognize that there is a ENT practice. And so in the modifier adjustment, you will see 1.5 related to bilateral procedures as the primary driver in this. And so in this case, using the modifier properly increase the procedures by or RVU units by 1,000. Makes a dramatic difference in calculating the compensation. There's a variety of RVUs or modifiers that you need to make sure you pay attention to, and some of them affect the RVU and some of them don't affect the RVU. Some of them will affect the payment without affecting the RVU. And so I'm not going to give a lesson on modifiers. I'm not sure I'm entirely qualified to do that. One of the modifiers we left off of our slides is 51, which is the additional procedures. Many people don't even put the additional procedures on there, and the payer will automatically adjust when they get the claim, and so that additional procedure is not in the billing record. Recently, we've seen physician practices hand over their CPT codes to hospitals and had to have the RVUs calculated, but the printout didn't include modifiers. And in the case of not having 51 on the list, it did just the opposite. Instead of increasing the number of RVUs as it did here with making sure the bilateral codes were noted, the secondary procedures not being noted, we actually had to go back, and in a couple of these cases they were our physician clients, and we had to go back and tell them that, no, that RVU's number was too high, and then work through what the proper number was, because we were concerned that they would be overcompensated. Likewise, if you're paying a physician on RVUs today, part of your ongoing compliance should be looking at those RVU reports to make sure the modifiers are included. It becomes, you don't want the fair market value calculation to have worked one way, and then when it gets into the accounting department, who are not necessarily coders or experts in modifiers, to calculate it another way, coming up with an answer that's not consistent with the contract or with the compensation opinion. So when we looked at this ENT, and we looked at the MGMA, and we looked at AMGA, we looked at the median, which is always, people will immediately kind of migrate to that median. Well, that's the safe place to be. There's actually now a case out in Texas, the whistleblower case, where the hospital paid some cardiologists at the median, but in their own practice they were only earning in the 40th percentile. And the other cardiologists complained that they were, quote, being paid extra for their referrals. Certainly if you're going, you want to be able to document wherever you are. The higher up the scale you go, the more critical it becomes to document where the physician is relative to the different norms. And you can see that there's a significant difference here between the national and the regional. In this case, we've published the southern number, and then we've just kind of quantified on a percentage basis how much do they vary. So this physician, in this case, was the national survey was above the 75th percentile, but for the southern survey was below the 75th percentile. And it's also important to know in each of those surveys the states do vary somewhat in terms of who you're comparing to. I don't normally think of Maryland as being a southern state, but they were included in one of the surveys as a southern state. So the pros and cons, it's certainly, RVU is certainly the way to recognize effort, and it measures the patient acuity that goes into it. The cons, there are potential errors in calculations. It can be impacted by the physician overcoding or undercoding. As you go into RVUs, particularly with something like the E&M codes, the office visits, if you see a high degree of coding going towards the 1.4s and the 1.5s, disproportionately, that will tend to overstate the RVUs, and you need to probably be reviewing the documentation that goes along with that. Office visits we've talked about. One, it's easy to measure. It encourages the physician to be in the office meeting access needs, but it doesn't necessarily account for all of the effort. Quality measures is the subject of an entirely different and hour-long presentation. Some quick things to remember. Quality measures vary by specialty. They need to be objective and clearly defined. They need to be objectives that actually add to the patient's quality. That is, that they're not something the physician should be doing anyway. You don't want to give somebody an incentive to do what you've already contracted with them to do. You need to consider the practice and the patient population, but you also need a proper baseline. From which point are you measuring the improvement in the care, so that the physician can know where he is. And
let's do our last polling
okay,
question. Yeah.
Let's see. We'll do. I think we've covered this earlier when we talk about converting the compensation from a private practice to an employment model. How are you going to deal with the things that were in that physician's private practice? The only one that I think we hadn't touched on is the advanced or multiple fellowships. These don't neatly fit into the survey. We had an example of a physiatrist, a rehabilitation physician, who was also fellowship trained in pain management and doing a lot of pain management work. The physiatry survey did not fit what he was doing in his practice. And now, Pam, we'll jump to the last survey question.
Okay. It says, what internal and external resources is your hospital currently utilizing to ensure compensation-focused compliance? And there's internal resources, external legal counsel, third-party valuation consultants, and all of the above. And I'll give that just a few more seconds before I close the poll. And just a reminder, you do need to answer 2/3 of the questions for CPEs. And there's no penalty for answering incorrectly. Okay, it looks like most people have voted, so I will share that. And it says 16% use internal resources, 6% use external legal counsel, 13% say third-party valuation consultants, and 66% say all of the above.
Okay, well, that's great, because we definitely think this is a process that is best accomplished through a team. And in closing, I would just say we touched on the definitions earlier about fair market value and commercial reasonableness, and how those are alike and how they're different. And the bottom line, when we get to the end of the process that we've talked about today, we are coming up with a range, both a range of dollar amounts per productivity unit, if that's applicable to the agreement, and also what the total compensation annually is implied to be from the agreement, considering all the stacking components. And then the second piece of that is assessing at those dollar amounts, is the arrangement commercially reasonable? And I've provided an example of what a conclusion as a result of that analysis might look like. And then the important thing not to leave out at that point is to do a sanity check. Does the arrangement make walking around sense? What is that total compensation, the concluded compensation per productivity unit look like? And are we above or below the survey, and what's the reason for that? Also, looking back to make sure the agreement has been applied consistent with the actual terms. That would be more appropriate if we're working with someone on renewing an agreement. And then, are the benefits and compensation comparable to other positions within the hospital. And we've already talked about full-time versus part-time. So just as Ken used the term a devil's advocate at this point, pointing out, is there anything about the arrangement that just doesn't sound right? We haven't left a lot of time for questions. If anyone has a question, we'll be glad to address it in the few minutes that we have remaining, or mine and Ken's contact information is included in the slides, and you're welcome to contact us with questions.
We do have a few questions if you have time to answer those.
Sure.
Okay. This one says, as more entities evolve into value-based reimbursement from health plans like shared risk tied to total cost of care and quality metrics for a panel, what surveys can be used as proxies?
I'm not sure that there is. I think with the surveys, you have a total compensation number out there. Those compensation numbers are largely out of private practices, and so they are production driven. And so I think you have to kind of rethink, while those surveys will give you a total compensation range, you have to rethink the objectives within that value-based agreement, because you're no longer paying the physician necessarily exclusively for service, although I think you still want him providing service to those patients for which you're doing value-based. But you may begin to break that compensation down into multiple pieces, and depending on how those are structured, how can that be shared with the physician when he does provide the enhanced value.
Okay. And we have one more question. It says, isn't it true that MGMA, AMGA, and SCA require WRVUs and collections reported excluding mid-levels?
To my knowledge, that is true. Where we're more concerned is how is it being reported in the physician practice for comparison to those. And we're also dependent on those practices actually complying with the requirement for reporting. But I think that our concern is what kind of reporting is coming out of the practice, not so much what's in the survey.
Right, that we're comparing apples to apples. If we understand the way that the survey was compiled is the data that we have from the physician, apples to apples, and presented in the same way that the survey says it was compiled.
Okay. It says, there's another, it says, do you say that a doc shouldn't get compensated extra for quality even though payers have P4P in their contracts? And it says, can quality be compensated in addition to base production comp? And it says, or should it be carved out? If so, how do you value this?
I think the physician can be compensated for quality. I think that it has to come in the context of total compensation. And the key to me for quality is having a good measured standard. I don't want a quality standard where the physician actually hits 100% of his target all the time, so that there's multiple pieces. But and I think that it will be more important as new contracts come forward, because if you've got a contract that's a year and a half old and you were compensating the physician at fair market value, and now you layer on a quality component, you have to ask yourself, is the new quality component, in addition to the existing contract, more than fair market value? So I don't think you can do quality in a vacuum. It can be a Part A and Part B to the contract.
Yeah, I think it would be important to model the cash, the collections and cash, and how the collections are going to be impacted by the new payer contracts, and then see how that could flow through to the physician compensation piece. Because I'm not sure that the surveys would adequately address that at this point.
Okay, well, thank you all. We are out of time, so if anyone has any additional questions, you can see the contact information for our speakers there, or visit the website, and please be sure and check back at our website for our September webinar, and thank you all.
And thank you, Pam.
Thank you.